Now, Professor Hawking, in the very last paragraph of your book, you say that if we discover a complete theory of the universe, then it should in time be understandable in broad principle to everyone and not just to a few scientists. And when that happens, all of us will be able to start discussing the why rather than the how. And I quote, "If we find the answer to that, it would be the ultimate triumph of human reason, for then we would know the mind of God." Do you think that God can intervene in the universe as he wants, or is God too bound by the laws of science?
The question of whether God is bound by the laws of science is a bit like the question, can God make a stone that is so heavy that he cannot lift it? I don't think it is very useful to speculate on what God might or might not be able to do. Rather, we should examine what he actually does with the universe we live in. All our observations suggest that it operates according to well-defined laws. These laws may have been ordained by God, but it seems that he does not intervene in the universe to break the laws, at least not once he had set the universe going.
Yeah, well, I think it's those big questions. Theoretical physicists seem to come up against those throughout their entire careers.
That's why I became a theoretical physicist. I wanted to bump up against those big questions.
Constantly. And so that's another question I was really interested in, is that I've heard that the majority of theoretical physicists are incredibly spiritual and have a great appreciation for the concept of consciousness and the soul and the universe and where it came from, because these are the questions that they're constantly asking. For yourself, what's your view on life, and where is it? What are we doing when we teleport life, if we ever get to that point?
Well, if I knew the answer to life, I would have an inside track up there.
Right. As would anybody. Yeah.
But let me tell you how we physicists view things, right? For example, Einstein was asked the big question, is there a God? Is there a meaning to everything, right?
Right.
And here's how Einstein answered the question. He said, there really are two kinds of gods. We have to be very scientific. We have to define what you mean by God. If God is the God of intervention, the personal God, the God of prayer, the God that parts the waters, then he had a hard time believing in that. Would God listen to all our prayers for a bicycle for Christmas and smite the Philistines for me, please?
Right.
He didn't think so. However, he believed in the God of order, harmony, beauty, simplicity, and elegance, the God of Spinoza. That's the God that he believed in, because he thought the universe was so gorgeous. It didn't have to be that way. It could have been chaotic. It could have been ugly, messy. But here we have the fact that all the equations of physics can be placed on a simple sheet of paper.
Right.
Einstein's equation is only 1 inch long. And the quantum theory is about a yard long, but you can squeeze it onto a sheet of paper.
Right, with a small enough font.
Right. And with string theory, you could even put those two equations together. And string theory can be squeezed into an equation 1 inch long. And that equation, by the way, is my equation. That's string field theory. That's my contribution.
Right.
But we want to know, well, where did that equation come from? This is what Einstein asked. Did God have a choice? Was there any choice in building a universe? When he woke up in the morning, he would say, I'm going to create a universe. I'm going to be God today. What kind of universe would I create? This is how he created much of his theories.
I think you must realize that some people are going to go to your show at the planetarium and they're going to say, aha, those scientists have discovered God, because God, dark matter, is what holds this universe together.
So is that a question?
It's a statement. You know they're going to say that.
So the history of discovery, particularly cosmic discovery, but discovery in general, scientific discovery, is one where at any given moment there's a frontier. And there tends to be an urge for people, especially religious people, to assert that across that boundary into the unknown lies the handiwork of God. This shows up a lot. Newton even said it. He had his laws of gravity and motion, and he was explaining the moon and the planet. He was there. He doesn't mention God for any of that. And then he gets to the limits of what his equations can calculate. So can't quite figure this out. Maybe God steps in and makes it right every now and then. That's where he invoked God. And Ptolemy, he bet on the wrong horse, but he was a brilliant guy. He formulated the geocentric universe with Earth in the middle. This is where we got epicycles and the machinations of the heavens. There was still a mystery to him. He looked up and uttered the following words: when I trace at my pleasure the windings to and fro of the heavenly bodies. These are the planets going through retrograde and back. The mysteries of the earth. When I trace at my pleasure the windings to and fro of the heavenly bodies, I no longer touch earth with my feet. I stand in the presence of Zeus himself and take my fill of ambrosia. What he did was he didn't invoke Zeus to account for the rock that he's standing on or the air he's breathing. It was this point of mystery, and in gets invoked God. This, over time, has been described by philosophers as the God of the gaps. Mm-hmm. If that's where you're going to put your God in this world, then God is an ever-receding pocket of scientific ignorance. If that's how you're going to invoke God, if God is the mystery of the universe, these mysteries, we're tackling these mysteries one by one. If you're going to stay religious at the end of the conversation, God has to be more to you than just where science has yet to tread. So to the person who says, maybe dark matter is God, if the only reason why you're saying it's because it's a mystery, then get ready to have that undone.
If you don't mind, can we spend a few minutes talking about God, if that's okay? So I'm just wondering, I too get asked at many lectures my view on God. And my typical answer is that, sure, there could be a God that's behind it all, and what we're doing as physicists, chemists, biologists, working out God's laws. And if that's how it is, I am thrilled to be part of that noble journey. I then add by saying, look, there's no evidence for that. I don't see any reason to believe that. And if what we're doing is just working out the laws of physics or chemistry or biology, and that's all that you need for a universe, I'm thrilled to be part of that journey. So the bottom line is, from a sociological, from a historical viewpoint, religion's very, very interesting, but it's kind of profoundly uninteresting to answer the deep questions, because I feel like all I'm doing is replacing one mysterious set of words framed scientifically with another set of equally mysterious words that are framed non-scientifically. Yeah. Now, I should say, after I say that, I always apologize, because I am all for hedging your bets. I'm not beyond that at all. What do you think of that view?
Well, I think that the sort of Newtonian, Newton thought that he was working out God's laws, and he was demonstrating the glory of God's mind when he worked out the laws of mechanics and so on. I'm not so at ease with that as you seem to be, because it does seem to me that if there is a supernatural, superhuman intelligence that worked it all out, in a way that undermines the entire scientific enterprise, because we are, maybe an evolutionary biologist feels this more strongly, the whole enterprise of evolutionary biology is to explain how you get prodigious complexity and design from virtually nothing. I mean, we hand over to physicists when we can go beyond the virtually nothing to the absolutely nothing. But if you start from quite an advanced level, bacteria, and work up to mammals and humans, we have a working theory which we know is true which explains how you can go from great simplicity to prodigious complexity, and finally to the sort of complexity which is capable of designing things, of creating things, of working out how to do things. Well, if you are suddenly going to insert a designing machine, a creator, an intelligence at the root of the universe, you've just undermined your entire enterprise, because your entire enterprise has been to explain how you get to something complicated enough to do design.
But even if that being just set in place the laws and then stood back?
Even that, even the deistic God who sets the laws in place and withdraws, if those laws, if the implication is that those laws were cunningly designed, cunningly crafted, as many people think they were, so that atoms should come into existence, so that chemistry should come into existence, so that stars should come into existence, so that nuclear reactions in stars could produce the elements, so that they'd explode and we'd get a suitable chemistry to make life, and then the origin of life and so on. If the deistic God thought all that through and set up the laws of physics, then he would have to be damn clever. He would have to be the physicist to end all physicists. I don't care if he then withdraws. He needs an explanation in his own right. And it seems to me that the noble scientific enterprise is to start from as near nothing as you can get.
Yeah.
Lawrence, why is it that most good scientists don't believe in God?
Well, I think you're overstating it a little bit. I think that most scientists don't think enough about God to know whether they believe in him or not. It's just irrelevant. There's no evidence that we need anything other than the laws of physics and the other laws of science to explain everything we see. Physics has been so successful in describing the universe that we tend to be the most obnoxious among the scientists in terms of our chutzpah, in terms of assuming what we can do. In fact, often overstating the case that science is all there is.
Why do you say overstating the case?
Well, because I've come to realize over the last years that it's really important to realize that science isn't all there is. We now can address with a straight face questions like, why is there matter in the universe, and what happened in the first billionth of a second. And so because of that grand sense of power, I think people tend to say, well, if we can understand things all the way back to the first billionth of a second, we understand everything. But science is not the only way of knowing. Many people feel some spiritual sense, and science doesn't address that. Some scientists would say because science doesn't address it, it doesn't exist. It's nonsense, you're fooling yourself. And that might be right. But if you can't test it, it isn't science. And there are lots of things you can't test. I think it is really important to recognize, as has been said, that science does not make it impossible to believe in God. It just makes it possible to not believe in God. And that's really important, because until you had science, everything was a miracle. So science takes a tremendous amount away from being miraculous and says there's just a pedestrian cause, maybe a wonderful cause, but it's a natural cause. I was at the Vatican once and at the Pontifical Academy and lecturing to some theologians, and I said to them, and I wasn't being facetious, that they had to listen to me, but I didn't have to listen to them. Because in some sense, I think to have an honest and sensible theology, you have to be consistent with the laws of physics.
Right.
But I don't need to know anything about purpose or ultimate purpose of the universe to understand how it works.
But is there an area beyond which science cannot go, and even in principle cannot go?
Yes, of course, there is, and I would say faith in some sense. Faith being defined as that which you believe in with the absence of evidence. I'm always hesitant to make absolute statements, because as we understand more and more about the history of the universe and understand whether our universe is unique, etc., we may come to grips with questions that have traditionally been theological ones. So I can't say that at some point we won't. But it is important to realize at this point what the limits are. And I think there's been a lot of interest in the interface between science and religion, and I find that unusual. Because I don't think there is much at the interface.
Peter, I hope you don't get mad at me, but for most of my life I've really been interested in whether God exists or not. And I have read and been exposed to and have the pleasure of speaking to many people who are scientists who have, if not proofs, demonstrations, inferences, the best explanation that they feel very deeply about that come to a belief in God. Mm. Do you see many fallacies that people use in order to prove or demonstrate the existence of God?
Well, they must all be fallacious because there is no God. It's whether you can detect the fallacy easily enough. I mean, I suppose a scientist would think of a first cause as a very powerful argument for the existence of God. Where did it all come from? Who started it off? And if this Big Bang was not the primordial Big Bang, was there a Big Bang much further back in time that he did set off and so on? A terribly difficult question. But I think that any question that is given the answer, well, God must have done it, is an abnegation of the intellect. It really is, it sounds as though it's a positive statement, but in fact it's a camouflage of ignorance. And so it means that people have stopped thinking. And if you are confronted with the question of a first cause, where the universe comes from, don't just slip onto the feather bed of saying God did it, because that's meaningless, totally, utterly meaningless. What scientists have got to do is to trace causes back to their origin and find a mathematical theory of the emergence of the universe. I hope that that will prove possible. There is no evidence yet that it will not prove possible. And any scientist who says that it is impossible to account for the emergence of the universe from nothing without intervention is not being a real scientist, is just too pessimistic. And they don't know. I mean, they've got thousands of scientists beavering away with cosmology, trying to get back to that last moment. It'd be wonderful when they get there.
If we look back historically, we certainly see science moving ever forward and religion, in terms of the explanatory areas that they deal with, retreating.
Yeah.
And perhaps religion is in some corner now, but they're staking out a very strong position. But let's look at the historical flow. And we have what is called God of the gaps, that every time something is not understood.
Yeah, it's abnegation of the intellect.
But, and we've seen it occur in many different stages.
Yeah, every time it occurs, it's abnegation of the intellect. So take that God of the gap, take it out of your sentence and say abnegation of the intellect. That's what it is. It's people giving up trying to think and using a kind of a spell. So that's all it is. I mean, it's just a spell. You've got to get from point A to point B in an argument. You've got a gap, so you weave a spell. You cast a spell, and you're there. and you call it God. You don't call it a spell.
And in the past, this has been true in a lot of the biological issues that have occurred. Certainly, the emergence of different species. We know that with Darwin. That prior to Darwin, there was the God who filled in those gaps.
The fabricator God, as it were.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, sorry, I just used God without the descriptive adjective.
Yes, quite so. But I don't see any part of the natural world, the physical world, let's circumscribe it for the moment. And you might come back and say, well, what about the spiritual world and so on? But I don't see any aspect of the physical world
Fair enough.
that requires the invocation of the spell we call God.
And religion has, in fact, been withdrawing that from different areas because they have to deal with evolution. Certainly the broad majority of scientists or people who are reasonably intelligent accept evolution,
Yeah.
even those who believe in God.
Yeah.
There's some fringe elements perhaps that
Yeah.
don't, but that's
Yeah.
so that's been withdrawn. But now they've put up their fortress in a new area.
Yes.
And so we have this progressive approach, and the new areas that are the defensive positions are the first cause that you mentioned.
Yes.
They are the nature of consciousness.
Yes.
There are very specific kinds
Yes.
of things now.
And the nature of good and evil, and
Yes.
things like that.
Right, right.
As it were, the moral law of the world. But I think even the moral law of the world can be understood in psychological, evolutionary, physical terms, as it were. I mean, we're all thinking beings, and that's the point. And we think our way through problems, and we think our through actions. At least we sometimes retrospectively think our way through actions and wish we hadn't done it, but and so on. But we can see that some things are appropriate and other things not. There are evolutionary pressures on us to behave in a particular way. There are psychological pressures on us, things like that. And science mustn't just throw up its hands and say, "We can't deal with that area of existence." Proceed cautiously, understand, try to understand our psychological evolutionary roots, and that will lead to deep understanding of human nature.
Why do these issues provoke such emotion?
People are terrified, aren't they? They don't want to be laid out on a slab and dissected and analysed. But I don't think, although I'm very optimistic as a scientist, I don't think people should have fear about what is being discovered. I mean, maybe people should be terrified of the thought that there is no afterlife, but they should come to terms with it and enjoy the pre-afterlife rather than waiting for the non-existent afterlife. They should but I think the driving force of morality in me is to not thwart the aspirations of others. And that seems to be a pretty good way of going through life.
But that sense of morality is not something that's...
It's not beamed in.
Yeah.
No.
It's not endemic. It's not a fundamental principle of how the world works.
No, not a fundamental principle. It's an emergent problem, an emergent aspect of the human brain. Brains living in societies and getting on with neighbours.
So as we look at people who put forth arguments for God, what is the appropriate response?
Go to a psychiatrist, I think. Really, I think it's deeply interesting that you've got these very clever people, scientists, some of them eminent scientists, who even in this day and age still believe in God. I mean, you're talking to a number of them. And it's quite extraordinary to me that that scientists, with the current level of understanding of the power of explanation and understanding and comprehension that science provides, that there are still people out there who think that there must be this sort of supernatural thing going on. I think they have to go to psychiatrists, really. It must be their upbringing which has given them some deep insecurity.
If you talk to them, you really see a great diversity in the kind of thing that they're talking about. Maybe everyone will use something like the word God, but if you scratch that surface, what that God is can be vastly different.
Yeah.
But still, it is an expression of something beyond the physical.
Yes.
It's something built into the structure of stuff.
Yes. It's something incomprehensible.
Yeah, right.
In a way. Maybe it's comprehensible once you're dead, but in my view, that's a bit late. But it's this incomprehensibility of the supernatural, overarching overlord, really, that I find extraordinarily difficult to come to terms with. And especially as I see not one iota of evidence in favour of it, except sentiment.
post-constructionism, neo-modernism. But I do spend probably a little bit more time than I should on religion, and I have a certain amount of hostility to it. I think the most rational reason for it is because of the harm that I see it does. We were talking about that earlier. Many people do simply awful things out of sincere religious belief, not using religion as a cover, the way Saddam Hussein may have done, but really because they believe that this is what God wants them to do. Going all the way back to Abraham being willing to sacrifice Isaac because God told him to do that. Putting God ahead of humanity is a terrible thing. Another reason is because I'm offended by the kind of smarmy religiosity that's all around us, perhaps more in America than in Europe, and not really that harmful, because not really that intense or even that serious, but just, you know, after a while you get tired of hearing clergymen giving the invocation at various public celebrations, and you feel, haven't we outgrown all this? Do we have to listen to this? But then, maybe at the very bottom of it, I really don't like God. You know, I mean, it's silly to say I don't like God because I don't believe in God, but in the same sense that I don't like Iago, or I don't like the Reverend Slope, or any of the other villains of literature. The God of traditional Judaism and Christianity and Islam seems to me a terrible character. He's a God who's obsessed with the degree to which people worship him and anxious to punish with the most awful torments those who don't worship him in the right way. Now, I realize that many people don't believe in that anymore who call themselves Muslims or Jews or Christians, but that is the traditional God, and he's a terrible character. I don't like him. I have a friend, or had a friend, now dead, Abdus Salam, a very devout Muslim, who was trying to bring science into the universities in the Gulf states. And he told me that he had a terrible time because although they were very receptive to technology, they felt that science would be corrosive to religious belief, and they were worried about it. And damn it, I think they were right. It is corrosive of religious belief, and it's a good thing too.